Welcome to today's webinar on learning about climate change and sustainability as if the planet matters. My name's Kathy. I'm from the content team at Pearson, and I have the great pleasure of introducing Peter Byrne.
My name is Peter Byrne, and I'm a co-author of the Pearson Humanities Victoria series. I've had the challenge of teaching climate change to high school students over the course of the last 20 years. Written chapters in textbooks on the subject, both in Australia and overseas, and it can be a controversial topic. But my approach has been to teach the science of the climate, consider the mechanisms of the natural systems that are involved, and to look at how human activities may affect those systems in the same way that I would teach other topics. By spending time on the fundamentals, we can get a higher degree of engagement from students, and I'll demonstrate some of those techniques in today's webinar. Learning about climate change and sustainability as if the planet matters. Well, of course it matters. But learning about sustainable development needs us as teachers to make a clear link for students between theory and practice. On the screen, you can see the 5 things that we'll cover in this webinar, starting with some terminology and keywords, dealing with an inquiry approach to the teaching and learning of this subject, a couple of areas focusing on citizenship, and finishing with the search for solutions. In this topic, we need to teach enough about climate change for students to understand the way that it links to food production, and at a deeper level, the way that food production contributes to climate change, without overcomplicating it, yet not making it so simplistic that it undervalues the issues involved or detracts from students' natural curiosity to learn more about the mechanisms of climate. And of course, all of this has to be done within the time constraints that exist in schools and classrooms. I'm going to make a few assumptions before we begin today's webinar. I'm going to assume you're teaching to a mixed ability class of Year 9 students with a full range of student abilities. I've designed an approach that could last 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the depth that you'd like to go into with this topic. And I'm going to assume you may want to make this a major activity or an assessment item, so I've planned elements of those things as well. You may or may not be using Pearson Victoria resources, but where these are relevant, I will point them out as we go. So we'll begin by setting the scene, and we'll have a quick look at some background work that you've probably completed in the course. So we're in the Year 9 food production unit, and there's a couple of curriculum outcomes on the screen. And I'm going to assume that you've begun work on the unit and that you've taught these curriculum outcomes to begin with. Now, climate change, which is the focus of today's webinar, comes a little way into the biomes and food security unit of work. Bear in mind, this is going to be the first time that many students have studied the world's biomes in this depth. They'll also be learning lots about traditional geography in the process, things that we probably haven't taught as much as we have in the past: countries, maps, cities, imports and exports. Take, for example, the word crop yields. Crop yields is an area that most students won't have heard of or won't know much about, but it's such a key to the food production topic. So my advice with this background work would be to take your time and to introduce the concepts carefully, unpacking them for students as you go. And some good focus questions will really help here, and you can see 2 highlighted on the screen. We've got 7A, what factors determine the productivity of biomes? This is a real nuts and bolts sort of focus question about the physical components of biomes as they exist around the world. And of course, you'll be taking a global view at lots of the world. And 7B, what is the relationship between biomes and food security? Now, while students may not have a great handle on a concept like crop yields, they'll certainly have a better understanding of food security through things like global hunger campaigns that they will have seen for helping people in different parts of the world where food is perhaps not so readily available. So make a strong link here between food security and biomes, and remember that not every place on Earth can be used equally for food production. Using these focus questions will really help set the scene for what's coming next as we deal with climate change. Now we start to set the scene by looking at links to climate change. On the screen, you can see the curriculum outcome for the Year 9 food production unit that's relevant to climate change. And I'll just summarise the interconnection between food production and climate change. And you'll notice that it's one of a suite of other issues that you'd be looking at in the course at this time. There's lots of entry points for learning about climate change as a Year 9 or a Year 10 student. Obviously, as a Year 9, we're in the Biomes and Food Security unit, and it's worth remembering that any work done on climate change is not only meeting Year 9 content descriptors, but it's also an investment in the future studies for students, because most of them are likely to study the topic of climate change in greater detail in Year 10. In Year 10, they'll touch on climate change again in the Environmental Change and Management unit, where there's course objectives that look at things like the factors that influence climate change, environmental worldviews, and the changes that are predicted for the future world. Now, I'd like to stress that in the Year 9 food production unit, it's important to study the interconnection between food production and climate change as a two-way street. It's a little bit like a double-headed arrow, with both elements influencing the other. So it's true to say that climate change may impact agriculture, and that will be the first focus of our study, but agriculture also contributes to climate change. Again, during this phase of the course, using some good focus questions will really help get your class started. 2 are shown on the screen. How do humans alter biomes to produce food? And what are the environmental effects of these alterations? And also, what are the environmental, economic and technological factors that influence agricultural yields? If you're working with the Pearson Victoria text, at this stage of the course, you'd be considering the following chapters. Chapter 7.4, Climate and Crop Yields. Chapter 7.6, Threats to Global Food Production. And Chapter 7.11, Climate Change. So as we start to consider climate change, we begin by looking at some terminology and key words. Now, I want to start by saying you don't need to be an expert in climate change to teach it. A little working knowledge of the mechanisms of the way that the world is heated is probably all that you need. And remember, the greenhouse effect is a natural process which is vital to our survival. So it's worth emphasising that as you cover the basics that we can see here on the screen. Starting with the reflection and absorption of insolation, these are key mechanisms of the way that sunlight interacts with the earth. So it's important to point these out to students as a good starting point to understand climate change. The conversion of light into heat is often skipped over as an important step in this process, but light actually has to be absorbed by surfaces before it is converted into the heat that warms our Earth. As we get to the next point, greenhouse gases, you'll probably find students have a fairly good working knowledge of what these are: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and so on. And of course, this is now where we can start to really teach students about the greenhouse effect, the mechanisms of the way that our Earth is heated naturally, and the life-sustaining process that makes living on our planet possible. In fact, the average temperature of the Earth is about 14 degrees. Without the greenhouse effect, it'd be something like 14 degrees below zero, and the Earth would be a much colder place. An analogy that often works well here to explain this to students is that Earth is a little bit like the Goldilocks planet. Just the right distance from the sun, just the right mix of natural systems that make life possible. Now, those are the basic ideas, probably taught in that order, that will help you introduce students to the idea of climate change. The next level of ideas involves making the link between humans and the natural systems that we've just introduced. So we start to talk about the enhanced greenhouse effect, the idea that the more gases that we put into the atmosphere, the greater their concentration and the more warming that occurs on Earth. Another analogy we can use here is the hot car effect, and the idea of what happens inside a car when you leave the windows up and the car exposed to the sun. It just continues to heat up and get warmer inside, as you'd know when you get back in the car and touch the seatbelt. Little analogies help students connect with the concept of climate change. And the next point's a very important one. The enhanced greenhouse effect leads to global warming, the idea that the Earth gets hotter over time. And I think it's important to separate global warming as an idea from climate change, because climate change is what happens once the planet gets warmer. And it's also worth bearing in mind and perhaps pointing out at this stage of the course that climate change has very different implications in different parts of the world. In some societies and some communities, climate change might bring positive benefits to agriculture, whereas in other parts of the world, the benefits are clearly negative. And the final point on this slide is that it's important to rule out a common misconception here, and this relates to the ozone problem, with some students often associating the hole in the ozone layer with global warming. And I point this out because I think it's worth unpacking that and making it obvious to students that these are two separate problems. Now, the information that you see on this slide is possibly 1 to 2 lessons worth of teaching, perhaps more depending on how much detail you want to go into. Don't assume all of your students will get this all at once. It's quite sciencey. Some of it can be a little bit technical. So some of these ideas over a number of lessons and revisit them over time. It's also a great opportunity to pick up learnings from other disciplines or subjects. Students may have been learning about climate change in other places. So talk and discuss, see what they know. It will all help in the end. We move on now to the next phase of the webinar, which is setting up an inquiry approach. It's important that we begin to demonstrate to students the tools that will help them understand the climate change mechanism. In my teaching, it's been helpful to use animations. After all, when we're talking about things like greenhouse gases, reflection, absorption, some of these concepts are a little esoteric and not always easy to observe from a classroom. So, examples of key processes that you might want to illustrate through some online animations are ideas like the heat budget or the greenhouse effect or the enhanced greenhouse effect. And later on in this webinar, there'll be a listing of websites for some animations that you can use. And there are many more than those I've listed. So choose those that work for the ability level in your class and which you feel comfortable explaining as a teacher. At the same time, don't underestimate the usefulness of a good diagram as a learning tool. Geography teachers know the value of good diagrams. And of course, animations lend themselves to being stopped at a certain point, and you can ask students to draw the information that they see or trade. That's the very basic level, those first 3 processes. If you've got a very able class or some very able students, you may also consider looking at atmospheric circulation as a natural system. This is the way that the Earth's pressure systems and winds are created. And the reason I suggest this is that climate change will have a series of quite interesting impacts on atmospheric circulation, and it hints at some of the complication of the climate models. And more able students, those above the level, may well find this very interesting and a point for further study. Once we've started to set up the inquiry approach by prompting students to find things that will help them understand climate change, we can use the sorts of questions that are shown on the right-hand side of the slide here. We can pose questions to students to help them delve deeper into the topic, and they can draw on a range of sources as they do so. So beginning by explaining the difference between the greenhouse effect that keeps our planet warm enough to live on and the enhanced greenhouse effect as it's impacted by humans is a good place to start. You notice the second dot point is about including visuals, that idea of the animations and the diagrams that help students to explain their understandings. And of course, then we can start to look at some of the impacts that global warming and climate change might have, and we can link those back to food production. Now, this sort of inquiry approach is a really good opportunity to do some group work in your classroom. You could perhaps divide groups by the different world biomes. You can choose to focus on the biomes that produce the most food, or you could look at all of the biomes. As we begin our inquiry approach, there are also a range of other useful websites that will help students broaden their understanding. In particular, in terms of impacts of climate change, students will need more detailed sources of information, especially around observed impacts, things that can already be seen, and predicting impacts, things that are likely to happen in the future. Key sources of information that I've used in the past include the Australian Bureau of Meteorology and the NASA website. These are generally very student-friendly sites to visit. Added to that, the information presented is usually highly visual, including lots of photos, animations, videos, and diagrams, things that students will find interesting. Websites of other organisations like National Geographic or NGOs are also useful, and they tend to put a human face to the issue of climate change. And this is probably the right time in the course to introduce this type of information. For those students who are above level, some more detailed information will be found at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration site, NOAA. This is an American organisation, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, this information will be more complicated, but it will certainly delve deeper into the predicted impacts of climate change and will really consider the scientific basis on which that evidence has been gathered. On the screen on the right-hand side, you can see a little learning activity that starts to pick up on some of these points. You can see that State of the Climate reports available from groups like the CSIRO or the Bureau of Meteorology can be accessed by students to delve deeper into this topic. By now, students should have a fairly good understanding of the mechanisms of climate change. So now it's a good time to make the focus more relevant to students and to begin to encourage forms of environmental citizenship. We might think about questions like this. What is our contribution to climate change and global warming as, say, an individual or a family? And we might start to consider lifestyle choices or decisions, some at the family level and some that we make every day as we live our lives. Some examples of tools that you can use to help show this to students are things like carbon calculators and ecological footprint calculators. In my experience, these tend to make our impact on the climate system very understandable by putting it in terms that we can access in terms of energy used, just going about our day-to-day lives. What we're really linking in with here is the idea of cause and effect, the relationship, causes and consequences as it's referred to on the screen. It's the idea that we all have a role to play as environmental citizens in what the future Earth will be like. So on the screen, you can see an activity from the Teacher's Guide about creating an audiovisual display in which we can start to investigate some of the consequences of human activities and the impact that they'll have on our climate. This is easy to link to food production. And you may use something like this as a formative assessment, a way to help students start researching in more detail, or you might like to make it a project, an inquiry-based project. It's about at this point that differences will start to emerge. Different worldviews that students hold might well come out, particularly as they start to investigate the impact their lifestyle has on the climate. But that's the challenge of humanities, is how we actually manage different worldviews and plot a course for the future. As well as encouraging forms of environmental citizenship, we can actually go a step further as well and model global citizenship, because of course climate change is a global issue. I think it's safe to say at times when students study climate change and global warming, they can become a little frustrated. There can be a feeling that why isn't anyone doing anything? Why isn't action being taken? And Year 9 students, Year 10 students in particular, are very good at realising that we need to make a collective effort to address an issue like climate change. So on the screen here, we see planning a citizen action campaign. Now, this is optional, I think, as part of a course. This is a great activity to do, but your decision about whether or not to do this might be based on your class dynamic, your school context, or whether or not you feel comfortable with facilitating this as a project. Time is also a factor. Planning a good citizen action campaign is going to take a number of lessons. On the screen on the right-hand side is a skills builder related to the steps involved in taking this kind of action, developing a plan, choosing a course of action, creating a campaign and then launching it. Now, this is great because it demonstrates and gives students a chance to demonstrate themselves lots of critical thinking skills, things like teamwork, listening, negotiation, the art of compromise, strategic planning. You may or may not do all of the steps that are involved in this project, but all of these are vital skills required by global citizens. There are a number of other websites that show you the type of action that other groups are taking. These tend to emphasise global citizenship very strongly. Within Victoria, Sustainability Victoria has a fantastic website that shows lots of information about things that can be done in and around the home or by organisations or businesses to actually make a difference in terms of climate change. Above level, the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and their Switched On Schools program also takes this into more depth and detail. It'd be worth showing these sites to students, even just to browse them, to show that lots of organisations are actually taking action and promoting positive campaigns. And the key question here is, what are the solutions to climate change? Groups like these are providing a range of strategies. On the screen, we have a targeted above-level assessment looking at the strategies that are being used to reduce global warming on a global basis. So if we think back to using those calculators for carbon calculation and ecological footprint, very much focused on the student as an individual or a family, this is now the point of the course where we're asking students to look more broadly and to look at countries that are facing challenges due to climate change and what they're planning to do about it. We're beginning to head towards some forms of summative assessment, more research, but perhaps with the idea that at some point in the course we're going to validate the student inquiry process. Perhaps it'll be a project, perhaps it'll be a class presentation. Again, at this point, it's an excellent opportunity to do some small group work, perhaps in pairs, having students looking at different countries. And those countries may be selected from a pool of countries that you've chosen because you're aware that they're making good progress in the area of climate change, or they're using different strategies to achieve their aims. As we move to the search for solutions, we begin to draw out student knowledge of the impact that climate change is having on food production, and more importantly, what we can do about it. Now, a good tip at this point of the course is to use a causal framework such as the one shown on the screen, DPSIR. D, drivers, and in agriculture and food production, the drivers are the farming techniques and the processes that we use to actually produce the food and fibre that we use every day. The pressures are a range of things: increasing global population, land degradation, putting more pressure on the available farming land that we do have, increasing levels of development and higher standards of living, and of course climate change itself, which is causing agricultural systems to adapt and mitigate. The state is the reports that we've read from groups like the CSIRO or the Bureau of Meteorology, the actual state of play. Where is our climate now? And the impact is not only being felt by present generations, but future generations. And again, Year 9 and 10 students connect very strongly to the idea of intergenerational equity. Are we leaving the earth in a better state than in which we found it? A real focus at this stage becomes the R, the response, the model of intervention. What actions are being taken by different stakeholders to address the issue of climate change? Good rule of thumb here is to encourage students to look at stakeholders from a range of areas. So local, national governments are good examples, the international community. We can also divide stakeholders in other ways. We can divide them by environmental, social, economic and political groupings, or perhaps we could divide them by their worldview. On the screen, we see how we might apply the DPSIR framework to environmental change. There's lots of environmental change issues listed here, but you can see it works equally well with food production. We may also consider context. How does this framework differ in a less developed country compared to a more developed country? And that's really the beauty of this topic, is it is so many levels and so many different approaches that we can take as we investigate. Of course, there are other starting points for response and models of intervention which can be found on the internet, and here are some others that we haven't looked at. For a national perspective, we could go to the Department of the Environment and Energy and look at how Australia is meeting its emissions reduction targets. Or we could choose somewhere closer to home and we could look at the FUSE website of the State Government of Victoria. It's a particularly good website, up-to-date, relevant and very wide-ranging. And all the time here, we're encouraging students to link back to the likely impacts on food production. So in summing up, what we've looked at today are these key points. We began with the terminology and keywords associated with climate change, and we talked about the need to embrace the topic and the teaching of climate change, to teach those scientific models and the mechanisms of the subject so that students can get a real sense of engagement. We talked about how to set up an inquiry approach, promoting lots of research, questionings and tools. The idea of facilitating discourse, which means broadening the search rather than providing all the answers to students. Focus questions certainly help, and we've seen that there's a range of sources to meet the different levels of ability that might be in your classroom. But I can't emphasize enough how useful it is to facilitate the inquiry approach rather than needing to be the climate change expert. Encouraging forms of environmental citizenship help students understand causes and effect, or the causes and consequences of our actions as humans. And modelling global citizenship takes us a step further by looking at the strategies and, more importantly, perhaps the skills that we will need to employ to solve the issue of climate change. And we rounded out with the search for solution, the DPSI model, the completion of our inquiry that takes us from our understanding of climate change through an analysis of the issues and perhaps an evaluation of the solutions, or maybe even the synthesis of our own solutions.
Thank you, Peter. We hope you've enjoyed today's webinar. The Pearson Humanities Victoria 7 to 10 series is available for inspection, and your friendly Pearson consultant would be happy to provide access and demo any digital resources, teacher support materials and LiveBooks data assessment. For a copy of the slides and a list of the web links, or to book a demo, or for any sales related queries, please contact your local Pearson sales consultant. On behalf of Pearson, thanks for joining us today.